Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Thanks for the insightful, but short but insightful sort of overview of where we are at the present moment. And I think some of the questions that I probably would have thought of asking, you've already sort of like talked about it within your slides, and maybe maybe we might want to we might want to go through it a little bit again and maybe expand it a little bit. Obviously, we, as you can see from the slide, we don't have a lot of freedom in Malaysia, I guess, in terms of media freedom, for sure. Not as bad as Singapore, but that's not saying a lot. But in terms of like obviously understanding that there isn't any real freedom, and the fact that you need to get stories out there, how do you work around the parameters of going for stories that you know will be that people need to read about, but at the same time protecting yourself from incrimination, from jail, etc. How do you work around it, I guess?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it just boils down to risk assessment, right? And whether you want to take that risk or not. So it depends on the gravity of the situation. So it boils down to a case of the kind of battles that you want to fight and you want to pick. So that means that yes, we have to be very selective to a certain degree about our coverage. So for example, I'll just give you a real life example in this case. So while the emergency ordinances were in effect, it's currently been, I think, repealed, and there's a 6-month period to it where it's officially repealed only next year. So once they lift the emergency ordinance, there's the sunset clause, right? But prior to this, when it was still in effect, we came across a story that was factual, that was about a certain development. But then one of the concerns that were raised was that if we were to push out that story, it would lead to issues like vaccine hesitancy, for example, right? And that could get us into a lot of trouble because, of course, we do not want to be the reason for vaccine hesitancy. Neither do we want to be the reason for anything to derail that effort, right? But at the same time, we also have to ask ourselves whether it was worth taking the risk, because if you were to publish a story, immediately the government could wield the emergency ordinances, and the whole lot of us would be put in jail. So, and the emergency ordinances protect the government, the the enforcement agencies and the enforcement officers as well. So there's no way you can seek recourse if ever you're found innocent, so during that process. So it becomes a matter of picking your battles. We didn't run the story. That story never saw the light of day. So it just boils down to that, really. How do you pick your battles, or whether it's worth the risk? Are you willing to suffer the consequences?
Okay, that makes sense. But in terms of when you have a story like this and you know that it could be I guess polarizing, for lack of a better word, how do you, obviously, do you consult with like your in-house lawyers? How do you determine whether you go ahead or not, understanding the risks involved? You talk about the risk analysis, obviously, when you run it, obviously I would say the end justifies the means, maybe. So how do you determine? Do you consult with your lawyers, or do you just go by gut feel, like the story?
Yeah, so one thing I usually advise a lot of people in journalism workshops and so on is that the reason that some of us can afford to do what we do is because we do have legal backing, right? So in that sense, I do have legal protection for stories that I run at the Vibes. And even when I run stories on the Malaysianist as an independent journalist, I do have a lawyer with me who helps do stuff pro bono, right? So there's always that legal covering there. There's always the ad cover. And when I come across stories like this, generally the first thing to do is, after writing the story and after ensuring that everything is factual and everything, it meets those standards, the basic journalism standards, it's always sent to a lawyer to sort of provide a legal opinion, because then if they're willing to willing to sort of protect, I mean, to back you up, and they say, okay, look, it's something that we can take on, then why not? But if they are risk averse, which, I mean, the lawyers that I generally deal with are very risk averse. So they will say, maybe you want to hold this off, or maybe you should try to get a bit more information on certain aspects which they believe is a bit loopy, or is a bit weak. So yes, we do have legal opinion. We do consult legal opinion.
So do you, when you come up with I guess a story where you have varying sort of like perspectives, and with the advice of a lawyer, to actually have maybe, I guess, a second look at it, or a way to make it, maybe restructure the piece? Do you, I mean, I would imagine that you probably would get it, maybe not a second opinion, but maybe speak to other people to formulate a piece? Or do you, like, you may have an angle for sure, and and you run it by your lawyers or your team, and they the advice is to maybe have a second or third opinion? Is that how you get like that's how you bolster your piece to be a bit more, I would say, to be seen as a bit more impartial, if that's the right terminology for it?
I mean, it isn't more of it isn't a case of being impartial. I think when you're going in that kind of direction, the best defense is always justification, right? So in that sense, what you write has to be factual. It isn't a matter of impartiality. Neither is it because for example, recently Malaysia Kini lost a defamation suit over reportage, and reportage used to be a defense whereby we canvass different opinions, different quote unquote stakeholders. We get a reply from the companies to have their say. So it was a very balanced story about I think it was of an environmental issue in Pahang, right? And so they lost that case simply because the company at least argued efficiently enough to discredit their report, right? Because there were sort of gaps there in the report. It is not so much that they didn't take the effort to ask for feedback and so on. So a right of reply is, while it's good journalism and it's good practice, it doesn't mean that you can get away from it. So the best defense is always justification. And in my case, for example, we did run a story on the finance minister, and he has his relatives actually were beneficiaries of a startup fund. It was a fund of funds kind of thing, and two of his relatives were sort of beneficiaries of that fund. But our report was merely factual, in the sense where we were stating who were the winners of this, who received the award of this of the fund, and how much, and the ownership behind those companies. So of course, when there were 8 companies, 2 of the 8 companies were linked to the finance minister, and that was a factual report. So he did send a letter of demand to us, but we were able to reply back and defend it because it is a factual report. There was nothing unfactual about it. It was based on public documents. So I think he didn't pursue that after a while. I'm not sure if he's here, then he'll probably remember, but no, he didn't pursue it. So in that sense, I guess you want to be as factual as possible. And that has always been the case over here. Previously there were a number of defamation cases, and usually you'd win when it is based on facts. Not so much not so much on reportage or right of reply. It's good journalism practice, and of course it does help strengthen your case, but always it usually comes down to the wire, and that means providing as much facts as you can.
Do you think that I mean, you're talking about it from a Malaysian standpoint, but you know, take a country like Singapore, right? Where obviously they have lesser freedom. Um, do they work around the same sort of principles, do you think? Or it's, you know, principles aside, it's just harder to get things out there because of the way society is structured, or the country is actually structured? I mean, would you say that most countries within, I would say, our region sort of like share your sort of approach in terms of reporting?
Yeah, you see, I think even regionally, the trend is not so much about about uh, facts. I mean, yeah, of course, facts is very important. They are very important, but it's what kind of facts you're putting out there, right? So, for example, even in Singapore, I think a new narrative was very is an interesting subject, and I think the founder Thumping Jin, his home was raided, and his laptop and his devices were confiscated, and a year later they just returned it back to him. You see, and I think I saw a tweet, or he wrote about it, and he said that, you know, it was just trying to be a nuisance to him, because he was critical about the Singapore, I mean, the current state of Singapore in that sense, or he was at least trying to get people to think about some of the old structures that are in place that propped up Singaporean society. So I guess to a certain degree, governments of the day, I mean, in the region do not like to be agitated, right? They do not like to be, they do not like annoyances. So that is actually one of the more difficult things to navigate. So it's the same thing with Myanmar. I mean, Myanmar is also very difficult. So it's not an easy thing. Even and that's the same that applies to Vietnam and Thailand as well. Thailand will tell you that, yeah, we do have citizens can have freedom of expression, but you know, when you really apply that, when you start putting out factual reports, is the kind of facts you put out. So that is the issue.
Right. So I guess that covers the question of the fact that we don't really have freedom, you know, freedom in Southeast Asia. But you know, I mean, we always talk about, you know, in our line of work, we always talk about how stories have the stories or narratives have the ability to affect change, right? To create change. But do you know of any particular sort of like stories, not necessarily the stories that you've written, but stories that others may have written that may have changed public policy in some shape or form?
Yeah, I think there were a few investigative pieces previously that were brought all the way to Parliament, and sought the approval of lawmakers. And I'm thinking, was it sexual? I don't know. No, we haven't tabled the sexual harassment bill yet, but I think there were a few issues. Or was it with migrant workers? I'm not too sure. I'm not really sure about that. But there were instances whereby Malaysian other Malaysian news portals or newsrooms did that. Was an extensive investigative piece, and it went up all the way to Parliament, and I think it received bipartisan support. Wow. So there have been instances of change, a social change, but it all depends on what kind of change. You know, and I guess it's a matter of just trying your best to push that agenda, I mean, for change, to see how far it can go. So there have been certain instances, yes.
Okay, so you know, it's like so maybe we talked a little bit about the media standpoint, and you talked a little bit about you know, how COVID has sort of like impacted our region, you know, not only our region but globally. You know, but I guess it's there's always sort of like, you know, as we know, I guess there's always been talk that mainstream media is somehow controlled. Obviously, we all know that. You know, I guess plus you add on social media manipulation, and then, you know, it's extremely rife across the world, but also more so here in Southeast Asia. I guess in Cambodia, I think there were, I think according to a Human Rights sort of watch, there were 2 reporters that sort of like were jailed, right, for writing sort of like accurate criticisms of the government. Yeah. So, you know, and then of course the whole Maria Ressa thing as well. So, you know, what I mean, like, what are your thoughts on it? Obviously, you know, I guess you straddle both. You work for, I guess, a mainstream sort of like a publication, but at the same time, you are an individual sort of like outlet. So, you know,
Right.
what are your thoughts on it generally?
I think if you look at the mainstream media, people are saying that they are sort of on the decline because of news portals, right? And the advent of news portals, assuming that they still operate in print, right? Or they were operating in print. But the thing about mainstream media is, to a certain degree, they have had a dominant position in the industry. So, you know, there's still that value, for example. So, for example, in Malaysia, the Star is owned by a political party. I mean, the Star is a publicly listed company, so its ownership, it's out there, it's public, right? And people rant and rage against the Star because of biased reporting. But you know, if you were to ask brands to advertise, they wouldn't have any problems, because the Star still commands that reach, right? Because they have been in a dominant position for so long, and that they are just very much resourceful, right? The Star has its own printing press. It has a huge online team. I mean, to sort of emulate that kind of level of operations is going to be downright impossible for any new player, including the one that I'm working for at the moment. So the organization that I'm attached to is considered alternative in that sense, because we don't come from that same cloth, right? But so that is the thing about mainstream media. They command that kind of influence, if you were to say. So it's easy for them to pivot. It's easy for them to sort of get you know, add dollars in, because they have very good connections. Of course, the other side to it is the politics of it, and because they're politically linked, so it depends on the government of the day as well, whether they're politically aligned or not. But even in our case, for example, when we saw a change of government, while yes, the Star and other mainstream portals did suffer some hit to its revenue during the early days, but after a while, things got better, because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if you're a brand and you want your brand to be seen out there, you're looking at eyeballs and you're looking at all these other metrics, then you definitely have to go there, right? I mean, where else are you going to go to? It'll take a longer time for another portal to emulate that sort of traction and branding. Yeah, so that's one side of the debate. And the other side, I guess, is also the alternative side, and it very much depends on the country. So, you know, like you clearly pointed out, in the case of Cambodia, I think there was a newspaper that was shut down because of its criticisms of the government today. You know, there are some, you know, so there are people in Maria Ressa as well. So it's very different. I mean, Southeast Asia is very much very diverse. You know, and it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint certain aspects. So when you travel to different countries, the scene changes. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to look at. I mean, to sort of analyze and dissect. But you just have to sort of keep abreast of what's happening over there, because, like, if even, for example, in the case of Rappler and Maria Ressa, when you talk about ownership, you are looking. I mean, if you look at the current ownership is made public. Aside from Maria Ressa, you have, I think, a VC who owns a certain stake, Hong Kong-based VC, right? But you know, you wouldn't have that sort of thing over here in Malaysia, for example, where a VC would be willing to step up. Maybe because our market is smaller than the Philippines, right? But yeah, you have certain trends, you know, in different countries. So, for example, Indonesia, the press unions are very strong, you know. So that sort of gives some kind of buffer for independent journalists, stronger than what we have over here, you know. So, and I think they have a different set of laws as well that govern press freedom. Not saying that Indonesia and Philippines are any safer. I think in terms of deaths and injuries, I guess journalists over there face, I mean, a greater amount of you know, physical threats than Malaysian journalists to a certain degree. But they have, I mean, it's just a set of pros and cons. And some of these places like Philippines and Indonesia, they're huge markets. So I guess you can afford to have that range and the diversity as well. And, you know, sort of pick and choose, right? But in Malaysia, it's very much still a very small country. So those are just some of the things that I haven't talked about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, have you personally been, I would say, not harassed, but sort of like, I wouldn't use the word threatened. What's the word I should use? Cautioned. Have you ever been?
Yeah, yeah. I guess all of us who have been doing this kind of work have been threatened, cautioned, followed to a certain degree. But we are always equipped to sort of take necessary precautions. You know, and I think good seasoned journalists would know when to, I mean, would know how to sort of manage these things. I think it's just part and parcel of the job. I mean, during my early days, of course, I was a bit more scared and a bit more frightened. I wouldn't be able to sleep, you know, thinking that, you know, what's going to happen. But after a while, you get sort of desensitized.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and investigative journalism is also about thinking ahead. So, you know, for example, I wouldn't appear on Clubhouse to talk about stuff because you know, you want to sort of mitigate the risk. And also, for example, when we do investigative work, things are saved in advance. The laptops that we use are pretty much open to being confiscated. So we think ahead, we think a few steps ahead, and we prepare for the worst all the time. So there's no way we'll be caught napping, because anything can happen. If it's a raid, you know, and if you're holding on to sensitive documents, you know, that's it. You know, you're fried. So it's always about thinking ahead.
Right. I mean, I guess that sort of like covers sort of like kind of questions that I think Craig probably has one